I want to talk to you a little bit about, but I want to go back and tell you a little bit of my story. And it doesn't start in such, it pretty much starts in obscurity, although I was playing golf at Rice University. This is back in the Southwest Conference. So we had guys like John Daly in our conference, who was at Arkansas at that time, Steve Elkington at Houston, and Billy Ray Brown, who'd won all the tournaments, and Bob Estes. Some of these names are still playing the tour. Jeff Maggart was at Texas A&M. That was all in our conference. So it was hard to shine with those guys around you, most of those guys still playing the tour. And so I found myself, I went out and played for about a year and didn't make it, so I found myself in Palm Springs. And everything was great. Married my childhood sweetheart. It was wonderful. I kind of graduated up, and in about 2 years I found myself at the Vintage Club. And there was, if you don't know the Vintage Club in that part of the world, Indian Wells, Bill Gates happens to be a member at the Vintage Club, and kind of guys like that. And I got introduced to the president of BMW at that time, and I was over doing an exhibition. I'm in my mid to late 20s. I mean, that's pretty heady stuff for just a young punk out of Texas coming out, and found myself in that environment. We got back from that deal, and he'd started giving me sponsors exemptions to play in the BMW over there, and that was a great time. So, well, we returned, and I had to fly to Dallas for an issue with my sister. Got back, and no wife at the airport to meet me, and that's not a good sign. And so we got back into the house, and I arrived, had to take a taxi to get back from the airport. Pulled in, she goes, "We need to talk." And we'd been married about 2.5 years. And so we were there, and I was there on the couch, and she asked me a question, very pointed question. She looked me right in the eye, and she said, "Do you cherish me?" And I thought the answer to this question could have profound impact on the rest of my life. And I said, I thought, my lightning quick mind, I thought, well, if I say yes, she's going to begin to describe for me all the ways that I have not cherished her. If I say no, that can't possibly be good. So I did the tweener. I did the, well, I'm not sure, honey, what do you think? Which didn't work either. That was an equally bad choice. Within about 45 minutes, she had packed up all of her stuff, and she said, "I'm leaving you." Now, you got to realize this is not at the low point. This is at the high point. I mean, we were in Europe. We were traveling around. We had an M5 going 160 miles an hour on the Autobahn, recklessly, I might add. And I mean, we're right where we want to be. And yet, I'll never forget, I began to, like a baby, I mean, just began to weep. You can't possibly leave, and almost crawling on my knees. And I'll never forget, that moment it is still etched in my mind to this day. As she backed out of the driveway and I saw the taillights out into the dark, and virtually the middle of the night. And we never reconciled. She ended up divorcing me. And at that moment was a seminal moment in my life. I've told men in many groups similar to this, or smaller groups, and Links fellowships around the country. I said that moment was, without any question, the worst moment that I've experienced in life to this point, and in retrospect, the greatest moment that I've ever experienced in my life. It was at that point that I decided, I've got to figure this thing out. And so, fortunately, it was in the summer. Not a whole lot goes, probably not too dissimilar from Naples. Not a whole lot goes on in the middle of the summer. And I would just lay on the ground every day. I mean, we would close the shop at noon. I was employed at the Vintage at the time. Lay on the ground. Say, "God, I don't even know if you're out there. I don't think I know anything." Now, if you backtrack a little bit, I had ostensibly said the sinner's prayer or done whatever they told me to do, waved that magic wand over me to kind of make me a Christian. Whatever they told me to do, I did. But it had no substantive impact on my life. And 2 years later, I'm divorced, and we hadn't gone to church or anything. I was already had the salvation component already kind of figured out, I thought. And now I had to ask the question. In fact, the guy who led me to the Lord is a brilliant guy. I mean, he was a Harvard Law School graduate. We met when I was at Rice. He became my roommate. He would later become a Texas Supreme Court justice. He just stepped down from the bench a number of years ago. And so he had answered a lot of questions, and yet I still find myself in this predicament. So at that point, I decided to leave the Vintage and go on the road. Some members put a little money together. They'd asked me. I said I had no desire to play at all, but they said, "Why don't you go out and give it a shot?" I said, "This is a perfect opportunity for me to really do some vetting of Jesus." I know that sounds like an odd term. How would you vet Jesus? I said, I have zero interest in religion. To this day, I have very little interest in religion in terms of tenets of faith, practice. I mean, everybody has our orthodox statements that we believe, but I was interested in the person of Jesus, very disinterested in what you might call organized faith. Now, that's not to suggest I'm against the church. I am not. I am the church. If you're a follower of Jesus, you are the church. You are the ecclesia. You are the called out people. But I was very interested in knowing more. I decided to start all over again. I went on the road for 2 years. I said, this time, I'm going to make a decision on whether this Jesus was in fact who he said he was, or whether he was just an iconic figure, somebody who, it's not even arguable that he had a profound impact, probably more impact than any other human being that's ever had on the face of the planet. I mean, the fact that we're here and that we have freedom and democracy, all these things are really emerge out of the teaching of Jesus. Was he a Gandhi figure? Was he an Oprah Winfrey type figure who just changes the landscape of the social conversation and it just had to happen to come at a unique time? Or was he, in fact, God in human flesh? Now, those are two big deals. Was he raised from the dead? If he was raised from the dead, that is the seminal moment in all of human history. That makes all of our lives different. If we're just a cosmic chance and a materialistic worldview where there's nothing but atoms, random atoms, and chaos, and you're just, this gentleman right here is just a bag of chemicals, is that what he is? Or is there spirit and soul? Is there something transcendent, something beyond that? Those are questions that I asked. Those are questions that I wanted answered. And I didn't trust anybody to give me the answer. So I went to the text. I said, I don't know, maybe I can read this for myself. Well, no, you need a seminary degree and you need, no, maybe I can read this for myself. And for 2 years, I did my spiritual due diligence. For 2 years, I decided to vet Jesus. I wanted to find out, was he in fact the man he claimed to be, or the God-man that he claimed to be? That's the question that I had. After 2 years, I came to the firm conclusion that he was in fact God in human flesh. I want to talk to you just a little bit about why I came to that conclusion. Some of you may be in fact wondering. Some of you may go to church for 30 or 40 years, and yet deep down you wonder, is there something beyond this life? Was he actually raised from the dead? Those are the momentous questions that we have to answer. Otherwise, we'll do this half-heartedly. This won't mean a whole lot. It'll be nice to get together and talk to guys, have a breakfast, maybe get together in some of the fellowships with MGF or something like that. But it won't have a transformative impact on our lives. It'll be somewhere, it'll be more like a club. It'll be like the Rotary Club or something else. But if you actually get to a point where you come to the conclusion that he was, everything changes. It has to. I mean, it has to. I mean, it's illogical to say, yes, I believe a man was raised from the dead 2,000 years ago. And yet I have no real willingness to even understand what he said about reality or to live out what he said about reality. That just doesn't make sense. I think at the core of that, there's a deeper issue. Let me read real quickly something from Isaiah. Now, Isaiah is prophesying. You've got to realize Isaiah is prophesying about 700 plus, almost 750 years in advance of Jesus. By the way, he said this, and it shall be said, build up, prepare the way, remove every obstacle out of the way of my people. Well, what does that even mean? The Bible talks a lot about the metaphor of highways. Get up on the highway of holiness. It talks a lot about highways. And then in Isaiah 62, listen to what he says. He says, go through the gates, clear the way for the people. Build up the highway, remove the stones, lift up a standard. Well, the direct context here is the spiritual restoration of Israel. There's no question about that. It's Jewish people finally recognizing Messiah. But I will tell you that there's an application for us and there's an application for you and maybe your friends who you play golf with, maybe that you'll play golf with today. There are so many stones in the road for people to actually think about Jesus as being something significant or just being an icon. But there are many things. Many of you maybe have many of those questions today. Well, what about science? I mean, hasn't science really disproved the nature of the Bible? I mean, hasn't science, one of the things I love theoretical physics. In fact, I was on a flight here, I had to go to Houston and here. And I sat next to a precious Jewish man, and he began to ask me, he was a doctor, began to ask me some questions. As we talk about this, the emergence of Jesus, he had stones in the way in his road to be able to even think about or contemplate. So sometimes we just say, well, I invited my guy to the breakfast and didn't come. Well, I guess he can just go to hell. I mean, we wouldn't say that, but I offered it to the guy. He just didn't do anything. And yet there's a place in which a removal of stones is so significant. Sometimes it can just be a horrible religious experience or an upbringing. That's where I found my wife. I found my wife, that we've now been married 21 years, when I was on the road playing. She looked at me in the eye and she said, I'm a complete atheist. I don't want anything to do with your stuff. She told one of her friends. She goes, I really like this guy. If he just quit using this Jesus stuff, it's driving me crazy. Now there's something about, now I realize you don't want to get, you don't want to be one of those guys. But the fact of the matter is, there was a massive stone in the road for her to begin to see. Remember, Jesus talked often about whatever you do, do not become a stumbling block for one of these little ones. He's not just talking about kids. Your life can be a stumbling block for those who are trying to enter the kingdom. They said, if that's Christ, I don't want anything to do with it. If that's Christianity, I don't want anything to do with that at all. And yet there were many stones. In my own wife's life, she had a religious upbringing, and she used to get kind of beat up by some of the religious school that she went to. And she said, if that's God, I don't want anything to do with it. It was a long, arduous process of gentleness and steadfastness to begin to share a different Jesus than she had ever known. It was even in the time of Paul. Paul said, you guys are getting a different Jesus. It's a totally different gospel. We get that sometimes. The question is, what might be the stone in your road this morning, or what might be a stone in the road of someone you desired to talk to about Jesus? My point is this: whatever the stone in your road, begin to reason with God. Ask the questions. Or, if you've already made that momentous decision to be a follower of Jesus, you've already fully vetted Him, follow Him more, like Paul told the Thessalonians. Well, excel still more. But you may have somebody, maybe a child, maybe a grandson, maybe your own spouse. Maybe they have some significant questions that can be answered in an environment conducive to that. I would hope that that's what you see this entire organization as a place where men could come together and ask legitimate questions and not feel that they're going to be scoffed at or looked down upon. They want to use their mind to vet Jesus. They come in with many presuppositions, many ideas. But if you'll give them an environment, guess what? This valley will be transformed. Can I share just one last thing as we're kind of winding this thing down? One of the most grace-filled parables in all of Scripture comes out of Matthew chapter 20. It tells a story, Jesus speaking. He gives the parable of a man who went out into his vineyard. Some of you that have been around it may know. Went out into his vineyard early in the morning and invited the guys to come in. I say, I'll pay you a day's worth of wages if you'll come and work for me in my vineyard. And they did. And then he went out a little later, about just before lunch. Asked some more if they would come in. They said, yeah, we'd love to do that. Day's wages. I'll give you a day. And then he went a little later in the afternoon. By the last hour, it was 1 hour before closing time. He asked some guy, he said, what are you guys doing here? And he asked him a very pointed question. He said, why are you standing around here idle all day long? And they said, well, nobody hired us. And he said, well, I'm hiring you. You go into labor. So they worked a whole hour. Now these others, the Bible says in the parable, Jesus, had borne the burden of the entirety of the day, borne the burden of the heat of the day, and exhausted at the end of the day. Well, the first ones to get paid were the guys that got the 11th hour. They were the 11th hour workers. They came in, the guys, well, what are they going to get, $3? A tip for the valet? What are they going to get? Held them out and gave them an entire day's wages. So those guys are, oh my gosh, if he got an entire day's wages, I'm going to get loaded up here. Came to the last ones that had borne that burden all day. Gave them a day's wages. And as you can imagine, they were indignant. We've been working for you all day. These guys came in the last hour. And they said, are you upset because I'm a generous man? He said, is this not mine to do with what I want? You say, well, why would that be grace-filled? Maybe you might find yourself, you wouldn't necessarily describe your life as a life that has been devoted to the Creator of all those trillions of galaxies. You maybe coming a little closer to that time where you sense your own mortality. You're maybe in the last quarter. I know I'm in the second half. You might feel you're in the last corner. Time's running out. You're thinking, well, all this sounds good, but when you start talking about stewardship, I don't know about that because I kind of wasted my life. So go to that parable, you read that, Matthew 20. You let that sink in, you memorize it. Because what God is saying is that if I've called you, I've called you. And if I've called you late in your life, then I've called you late in your life. The day I got saved, the first time I ever spoke in front of a group, I had a guy come up to me. I didn't understand it at the time. He said, you've been called early in your life. I was called late. And he says, run through the tape with all of your passion. And I've never forgotten that. Let me tell you something, man. If it's late in your life, you don't really feel like you vetted Christ, first of all, get things right. Vet Jesus. Second of all, there's no way to then, if you come to the conclusion, and Jesus challenged you to do that Jesus was who he said he was, turn tonight, as you're in your room, go into your closet, go into a bathroom, get out on your knees and raise your hands to the sky and say, Lord, I want to give you my life. I don't know that I've ever really done that. I mean, I'm asking you to take me anywhere you want me to go. Use me in whatever way you can use me. And I'll promise you this, all the forces of heaven will come to your aid. And you will find yourself in the most extraordinary supernatural circumstances over the next few years that you could have ever imagined. He'll take you places you never imagined.